Desmond King. I'm a fellow of the British Academy and a professor of American politics. Today's event is the second part in a three-part series in which the Academy welcomes leading scholars of African American politics to explore the long history of racial inequality in the US. Part one, which is available on the British Academy's YouTube channel, featured Professor Megan Ming Francis of the University of Washington. Today, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor for part two of the series. Keeanga is Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, a writer and an activist. She's a contributing editor to The New Yorker and a regular op-ed writer in the New York Times. Her numerous books include From At Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, and the book Race for Profit, about how banks and the state failed to build up Black home ownership in the United States. Her recent articles in the New Yorker and in the New York Times include a piece about the Supreme Court in the context of President Trump's recent nomination of Amy Barrett to be the ninth justice, and New York Times pieces about the failure of the American state to make the US egalitarian. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll be discussing the history of the movement for Black Lives, drawing on the insights in Keeanga's award-winning book, From At Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. And towards the end of our conversation, we will take a selection of audience questions. If you would like to ask a question, please submit this in the YouTube chat section. You are welcome to tweet the event. Thank you. Welcome. To start with, I wanted to ask you about the roots of the movement for Black Lives, which was founded in 2013 in response to violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. 7 years on, and the movement is still playing a huge role, in fact, a larger role, in drawing attention to, in particular, to the deaths of African-American people at the hands of the police, and to broader issues of police violence and over-policing. The talks for change and reforming the police have been just that, as far as I can see, talking. Why do you think it's been so slow?
Well,
that's a big question, I know.
First, thank you for the invitation to come on and talk about my work and what's happening in the US. I would say that police reform in the United States is so difficult because it is so integral to American local governance, which is to say that for at least the last 40 years, there has been a kind of onslaught, a bipartisan onslaught, meaning both Democrats and Republicans to varying degrees have agreed that they want to minimize the imprint of state programs. There is a complete and utter hostility to taxing the rich, be they individuals or be they corporations. And so in the midst of enormous social deprivation, in instances where crime is an issue or where it is expected to be an issue, the police become what I describe in my book on Black Lives Matter, a kind of public policy of last resort. And I think that this has really been a phenomenon in Black urban life and increasingly Black suburban life since African Americans moved from rural locations into metropolitan areas. So at the various the very earliest years of the 20th century, police have been disproportionately surveilling Black communities, harassing, arresting, targeting Black people. And that is a continuity that extends over the century, over the 20th century, well into this 21st century. So when we talk about police reform, it means trying to disrupt a pattern that has been set in place for well over 100 years. And I think that when we take that long view of this, the difficulty in undoing racist police practices, I think, becomes much clearer.
That's really interesting way of putting it. I think thinking about the historical continuity is very important in this context. Policing seems to have moved in the post-60s, post-70s era to take what had been informal forms of violence in the earlier decades of the 20th century and institutionalize control, particularly in cities, but not exclusively in cities, which is disturbing because it suggests how important violence has been to the maintenance of the US political system for a long time. And I don't think observers and certainly people outside US always understand that. Do you think that's right?
I mean, it is one of the most clear characteristics of American society. Our country has, there are more guns than people in the United States, and so that the violence, takes on different characteristics. It takes on, I think, in some ways, it is reflective of a kind of tension that runs through U.S. society that reflects an absolute instability and insecurity about what the future holds. And I think for most people, they fall into that category. And when there is such massive precarity, it's the lack of stability can be really, I mean, it's located in many places, but I think the fact that there is nothing guaranteed you in the United States except an ability to work. So we have a very kind of anemic role that the state plays in any kind of meaningful way. And so when that is all that is separating you from absolute destitution, and now in the context of a pandemic, where people on the one hand are told to stay home, on the other hand, there's no assistance, there's no aid. Yep. The only thing Americans received by way of aid was a check for $1,200 last April.
Yes.
Right? That was the federal intervention. Now, a few people, not a few, but some people were able to navigate unemployment systems that had been deliberately set up to be confusing in hopes of dissuading people from utilizing unemployment benefits. But that by no means was available to everyone in this country. So everyone, most people, not everyone, but most people got a $1,200 check at most. There were some people who got a $600 a week supplemental unemployment insurance, and that's it. And so you have millions of people who are on the precipice of eviction, of being thrown into the streets. You have millions of people who have lost their health insurance because in this country, healthcare is connected to employment. You have millions of people who've lost their jobs. And there's nothing that, there is no floor or bottom that protects people in the United States. And I think that the underbelly of that is an incredibly tense, frustrated, and violent society that we're seeing. I think over the summer, where there was this strange pattern in crime statistics, where murder statistics were the number of murders being committed were going off the charts, while all other categories of crime were falling. I think speaks to the kind of rage that exists at the center of U.S. society.
We know a lot about evictions from Matthew Desmond's work, which I think is a very fine study called Evicted, and really brought to scholarly understanding the political economy of tenanting, and particularly in some communities of color. And I think we can see some of that coming up ahead. One of the things I like about one of the pieces of yours I particularly like was an op-ed about, of course, there are protests, the state is failing Black people. And you make the point in the article that just building on what you've been saying, Keeanga, that the sense that the state is either complicit or incapable of affecting substantive change, which is really frightening in some ways, because, and we'll maybe get onto this a little bit, but what is the movement for Black lives trying to get change then? I mean, are we trying to, is it to get a state that's effective? I mean, it's doing lots of things, I know that, but I'm just thinking in the context of this argument and your analysis. Because Matthew Desmond finishes his book Evicted, talking about how successful federal housing vouchers can be, so that there is a role for the state. I mean, I know not everybody agrees with that. That's not a complete thing, but you're rightly, and as you've just been saying, the state really doesn't provide very much support, and yet anybody who lives in a democratic society looks to the state to advance rights.
Yeah, no, I think that the movement, well, one, there's a divergence of opinion concerning strategies and tactics. And so there is certainly a strain within Black Lives Matter that view themselves as abolitionists. They view the abolition of police, policing, of prisons, the criminal justice system as a central objective of the movement. And so that raises very clear questions about what role these people see the state playing in if we are calling for the abolition of central functions of the state, which include policing. And then there are other people, who look at the movement and the focus on police abuse and violence as really somewhat of an entry point into a larger discussion about inequality in Black American life and what immediate steps can be taken to address those. And I think that there's another discussion to be had, which is how the struggle around securing immediate needs, and there are many immediate needs in the United States that overlap with race, they overlap with class, the issues with eviction, access to healthcare, employment, some sort of hazard pay for what are called essential workers in the US who are directly exposed to the virus. These are all immediate demands that that should be made and that people are expecting, certainly if a Biden administration comes into existence. But there's a political question as to what the relationship between that struggle for immediate demands or reforms is to a more transformative vision of really the need to rethink American society from top to bottom. And that used to be a discussion that was relegated to the far left fringes of US society. But I think that it's an open question now. I think that the fact that Bernie Sanders and someone who openly identifies as a socialist, a democratic socialist in the US is able to garner tens of millions of votes, from 2016 to 2020, speaks to a desire from millions of people to really rethink and reconceive of what American society can look like. And I think in some situations that means that there's a role for a reconfigured state, a repurposed state to play in that. And if that isn't satisfied, I think that we're seeing what I described recently as a kind of unfolding radicalization that continues to happen in the US that is largely driven by the utter ineffectiveness of our state institutions. Right. The fact that our government has literally stood by while hundreds of thousands of people have died, and still has no adequate response to this virus and to this pandemic. If you were to listen to the leader of this government, the President of the United States, last night he's suggesting that, don't let the virus control you. Don't let it dominate your life. Go on. That he himself had to get sick to prove that you can go out and you can get sick and you can recover and we can all just move on from this. That's been the government response. And so from that writ large to what happened to Breonna Taylor in Louisville, who was not only killed by armed agents of the state, but then when the mechanisms of the criminal justice system are set in motion to determine what we all know to be true, that the police killed this woman in her apartment, they say no. And so not only is it an affront to common sense and what we all know to be true, but it says to people that you actually cannot rely on these institutions to produce an equitable outcome. And when that happens, then the legitimacy of those institutions are called into question. And when that lack of legitimacy becomes generalized by people, then the question of what is the alternative to these existing institutions, to this entire form of self-governance. Is there an alternative to this? The space for that, whether or not you believe it to be true, the space for that discussion becomes even larger.
And so would you expect another Civil Rights Act? I mean, I've seen quite a lot of discussion about this, that a Biden administration might try to do something on the scale of the classic with some of these elements in it. Yeah.
The Black Lives Matter is advancing something called a Breathe Act.
Yes.
Call it a Civil Rights Act. I'm of the belief that I don't know if we need more kind of overreaching laws that say it's illegal to brutalize Black people. It's illegal to... These laws exist, right? I mean, we've had a Civil Rights Act of 1866, 1875, 1957, 1964, 1968. What we actually need is some enforcement of the Civil Rights Acts that have been passed for the last 150 years. We don't need a more bevy of laws. We do need policies that are directed towards dealing with the immediate deprivation that people are experiencing. But what we don't need are more symbolic laws that reaffirm the citizenship of Black people. We need those laws enforced, and then we need a redistribution of wealth and resources in the United States.
Yeah, that's the way to tackle institutional racism and structural inequality and material inequality, is significant redistribution. And
absolutely.
Yeah. That's great. Just going to a slightly related topic, a lot of surveys have shown widespread support for Black Lives Matter, for the movement for Black Lives, including a lot of white Americans who had not previously been particularly aware or particularly sympathetic or realized how bad things were. And I guess the arrival of cameras documenting some of the brutalities may have helped. I'm sort of concerned about. And every so often we see an article, I mean, not every so often, very often by white Americans just saying, I had no idea things were like this. I didn't know that the history meant these things. I'm puzzled by this because if you do a basic reading of civil rights in America, or just how the system was created, designed to maintain enslavement at the beginning, and how the institutions like the Electoral College and the Supreme Court, which we'll come on to, were designed to maintain a particular hierarchy. Do you have any thoughts on this sort of lack of understanding? I mean, there's a similar debate, I should say, going on in other countries, including here, about what the curriculum teaches children in schools, which seems to be quite partial and limited.
I mean, I think there are really two things. One is the assumption that people have read about these things, of course, is a wild leap.
Yes.
In the United States. I mean, there are all sorts of surveys that also show that people and kids in high school here don't know what century the Civil War was fought in.
Yes.
That they don't know. They don't know much about American history, and I fear that oftentimes that the history that is presented is distorted, and that is one that celebrates the mythologies of American society as one of on an never-ending quest of progress, and that the moments of racism, exploitation, of genocide that really that should shape our understanding of American history are completely distorted, if not left out. I was saying to you earlier, I think sometimes we in the U.S. describe this narrow way of looking at American history as a kind of political amnesia,
Yes.
when I think that it's more accurate to describe it as a selective memory about what instances and what aspects of history should be emphasized and what aspects should be either de-emphasized or completely ignored. So I do think that is one aspect of what we don't talk about in the United States, or probably most countries.
Yes.
Don't talk about the complexities of their histories in such ways that leaves enormous questions about, why are there immigrant groups in this country? As I heard Gary Young recently say, they are here because we were there.
Yes.
And that requires, you have to have read something to know that.
Yes.
And so those kinds of distortions leave us ill-equipped to understand the world that we live in today. So that's one part of it. The other part, I think, is not sort of really talked about in the US either, is that segregation is real. Segregation, the impact of segregation is absolutely real. So that when you have white people who periodically get a glimpse into the experiences of Black people, when one of these videos appears, that too creates a distorted understanding of the experiences of African Americans.
Yes.
In the US. But the impact of having no relationship with African Americans, never seeing African Americans, will certainly give you a skewed understanding when then those gaps are filled with a nightly news programs that disproportionately portray Black people as criminals, news programs that, or popular culture, Hollywood movies that portray Black people as gangsters and as criminals, that fills in the gaps that might otherwise be developed through being neighbors with someone, living with someone, having some kind of sense of a shared history and experiences with people. And so as a result of both of those, both that kind of organized ignorance in American society, coupled with racial segregation, we end up with a reality that most white people don't know, that for Black working class and poor neighborhoods, they are police states.
Yes.
They are absolutely police states where the police come in, they can do whatever they wish with you. They can stop you. They can frisk you. They can question you. Sometimes they beat you up, and occasionally they will kill you. And in most cases, it is with absolute impunity. Most white people don't know that. And so I think perhaps if they did, that there might be a slightly more complicated view of the police, and a much more openness to the utilization of state resources to try to ameliorate or mitigate some of the deprivation that exists in poor and working class Black communities.
I'm struck that the scale of racial segregation has grown dramatically in the last 3 decades. Americans think there's a story, laws passed in the 60s, implemented in the 70s, right, and then things are improving. School segregation has resegregated quite dramatically when you look at the statistics, and housing segregation is again dramatically so. And so you use the phrase, I think, organized ignorance, which is part of it, but I think deliberate pretense not to know about these things is also going on in the US as well. Now, they're helped in this process by a Supreme Court which has grown increasingly conservative in the last 3 decades and tackled civil rights by diluting it fundamentally. So one of the reasons, as you know, school segregation has gone up so much is because the court said ease the conditions for schools being released from integration schemes in the programs in the late 90s, and that's really had a huge effect.
Yep.
And in your great piece in the New Yorker, The Case for Ending the Supreme Court as We Know It, you remind readers that, the great celebration of something like Brown in 1954 is merely rectifying an outrageous decision in 1896 in Plessy, which set up the system of
absolutely
that survived. And I've always held that view. It's one I don't find my colleagues in political science warm. You're absolutely right about this. What are the implications of a 6-3 really tough conservative majority in the courts? I mean, most of the decisions in the last 20 years have been to do with civil rights, certainly have been 5-4. They've just scraped by the erosion of voting rights and so forth. Now it's going to be a very, very firm conservative coalition. And I think Amy Barrett will be nominated, maybe not before the election, but I think she will be by January.
Yeah, there's so many things to say about it.
Yes, I know.
Well, no, I mean, one that I brought up earlier, which is the legitimacy of American institutions. Here you have a Supreme Court that looks not much like the United States, is richer, whiter, more male than the country that it lords over. Now being put in a position to leave a kind of disgraced president who lost the popular vote, who won through a fortuitous combination of electoral votes, and who looks poised to lose his, this forthcoming election. No one ever knows for sure, as we learned in 2016, what will happen. But we have a deeply unpopular president who then gets to leave his thumb on the scales of justice for another generation.
40 years.
It is completely outrageous that this has the potential to exist. And so I think this question about the legitimacy of American institutions comes squarely into focus. That this unelected, unaccountable cabal of 9 people, and I don't care if they expand it to 13 or to 15, it doesn't change the essential character of what is essentially a monarchical organization making unaccountable decisions over the lives of hundreds of millions of people in this country. This will erode further the idea that this is truly a democratic society, and creates even more space, as I was saying before, for a discussion about an existential discussion about the nature of our society. And so I think that, I think that the potential for this, and it will be very difficult to stop this train from going forward. Will be catastrophic in one sense, but I also think, as I wrote in the article, that there's also such a way that ordinary people have their collective ability to respond to these sorts of injustices. And the Supreme Court has authored many unjust rulings over its long, undignified history. And the response to that has always had to be a kind of popular rebellion against the ways that the Supreme Court has tried to limit different groups' full realization of citizenship. So if they are successful, as they hope to be, in both undoing people's very tenuous hold on healthcare through the repeal of what is popularly called Obamacare in this country, if they are successful in finally ending women's right to abortion in this country, a legal, unfettered right to abortion, that will be catastrophic. And it also won't be the end of the story. And so I think.
Okay.
Hold on.
Okay.
Am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are. Thanks. That's great.
Not sure what happened there. That won't be the end of the story. It will really help to trigger a much broader political response through that, through the development of political struggles on the ground. But that's a terrible dynamic where people must mobilize themselves in response to an unelected, unaccountable body of people who make these decisions that we are then forced to into political protest in order to secure basic rights, in this country.
Extraordinary. We have this fascinating, and I do urge anybody watching who hasn't read your article in the New Yorker. When was it? It was 2 weeks ago, I think.
A couple of weeks ago, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago on the court to do so. There's a couple of questions have come in from the audience. Sure. Keeanga, I'm going to ask you. One is, which is interesting, to what extent have some of the newer theories, such as white fragility, moved away from structural towards individual and psychological explanations? Of what? But I mean,
I think in some ways that's an ungenerous reading of white fragility. I think that if you actually read the book, which I know a lot of people haven't, because the title, for conservative people is off-putting. The title for leftists mean that many of us just assume that we know what the book is actually about without reading it. So yes. I would encourage people to actually read the book because Robin DiAngelo does have a structural critique of racism in the book. And she's talking about something else. And I think that there is a tendency on the left to reduce racism only to questions of economy and structure. And miss the kind of wider effects that it has in society. And one of those is the way, I think she's talking about a specific group of white people, middle class white liberals who, think that they're on the right side and doing the right things, and often can act in ways that undermine the potential for greater understanding and potential for solidarity. And so in that sense, I think there's something useful about DiAngelo's book that, I don't think that we on the left should just dismiss because we perceive it to not have a hard enough or single-minded focus on economic questions. I think that we have to also have a more dynamic understanding of the way that racism functions in our societies.
And if we relate that to your book on homeownership, Race Before Profit, you try to get at, and this relates to another question which has come in about why class is so little used as a concept and variable. The question is, why is class not used by intellectual commentators when addressing systemic racism in the US? Should race and class be brought together? Which obviously they should, and you do quite a lot of that in the book and explain the two, I think.
Yeah, I mean, for me, part of my motivation for writing Race for Profit was to move the discussion about segregation and how we understand segregation in the US away from just this kind of, do white people want Black neighbors or not? This individual emotional decision sort of initiated by white homeowners or by white renters, and really to bring it back into the realm of political economy and understanding the sustenance of racism has a large part to do with its profitability in American society. And through these homeownership programs that I look at, then you can see that there are real actors with real interest in maintaining a segregated marketplace, and some in unanticipated ways, meaning that there's a role of Black real estate agents, there's a role of Black mortgage bankers who see it as part of their livelihood to maintain a segregated market, but that within the larger world of banks and real estate, there's a realization that even as Black incomes are rising, as they're moving from rural areas into urban areas, that there's a home ownership market to be developed here, just in ways that it doesn't spoil the exclusive white housing market that was so profitable for the United States in the post-war era. And so that was certainly at the forefront of my thinking. And we can continue to see the reverberations of this very racialized housing market in the US, and then understanding how that then also feeds into a popular conception of what Blackness is, and why there is this belief that the mere presence of Black people has a devolving impact on property values, is to, again, understand the relationship between race and class, is to really to understand how those things are independent of, separate from each other, but often work in a kind of in a very dynamic way together.
Yeah, I think you do that terrifically in the book. It's very, I think, bringing political economy in that way into this account of the housing market, because as you say, we know a lot about the preferences, and we have evidence from Sharkey and your colleague and Rob Sampson's works on the patterns in neighborhoods and how they self-reproduce. So getting at this as a political economy issue as well is very, very important, I think. At the same time, there's quite a few questions, not surprisingly, about the presidential election. Something also, how much impact will the outcome of the presidential election in November have on Black Lives Matters and on Black lives in general? And I wanted to put that with something from, you wrote a column, you may not still agree with it, but in June you wrote, called "The End of Black Politics" in the New York Times, and you said,
no, I still believe it.
Right. So you see a current period of, you thought we're in a transition from an old to a new era of Black politics, thinking about the fact that electoral representation is not sufficient and so forth. I think.
Yeah, I mean, the title of that piece was certainly meant as a provocation. And, what it's really calling attention to is the dead end of this formula in electoral politics that says that representation in and of itself, so just having a Black elected official in and of itself is good enough to represent the interests of the mass of ordinary Black people. And I think that, that was a powerful argument in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, when Black people were locked out of political power, even as we were amassing in neighborhoods and districts and not in a position to govern them because of the stranglehold on power by white political machines. And so that was a reasonable and rational response to being locked out of power. Well, 50 years later, hundreds of Black mayors later, thousands of Black elected representatives later, dozens upon dozens of Black congresspeople later, has not had the impact that people believe that it would on the lives of ordinary Black people. And that what we have found, that the further we move away from Black political protests, the more conservative and adaptive Black elected officials become. And that's not a moralistic argument. That's not an argument that suggests that there's something inherently corrupt or wrong with these people. It is to say that formal politics, at least in the United States, has a tranquilizing and conservatizing effect, especially in Congress, where your seniority allows you to then sit at the head of certain committees, and this creates new obligations and new responsibilities, and brings you into closer contact with all sorts of lobbyist and corrupting influences within politics, as well as the constant grind to keep your position and the constant fundraising as money becomes so central to the American political project, that these all have the effect of really watering down the political commitments of Black elected officials. And we see untold examples of this in city after city, where Black elected mayors and city council people simply maintain a status quo agenda against the interests of their poor and working class constituents. And so it raises a question of what will an effective Black politics look like? And so we see the emergence of a kind of counter Black politics, a radical or from below Black politics that has developed around Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black lives. And even within these constellations, there are all sorts of differing ideas about what a Black agenda should look like, what a political agenda should look like, but a common recognition that what we have now in the realm of formal politics and formal Black politics that is deeply embedded and connected with the Democratic Party is not working for the mass of Black people. And so that is sort of the platform that the debate is being had out now about what a new Black politics would and should look like.
So what are the implications for if there's a Biden presidency, which it looks like there will be, and I think the Democrats may well get control of the Senate as well. Will this be a political opportunity, or?
It will be as much an opportunity as people on the ground make it. I think the idea, we have a long history of do-nothing Democrats in this country. And so the idea that simply changing the guard will produce a real tangible outcomes for Black people is mistaken. It may stop the mounting carnage of the Trump administration. So to that extent, I hope Biden does win. But that in and of itself doesn't mean he, the most conservative wing of the Democratic Party, of the candidates who ran in the primary, will produce the results that we want. And I think that thus far, his scale of reform is really out of step and out of touch with the enormity of the crisis that exists in this country. You can see that with him clinging to this idea of affordable health care as millions of people lose their health care. We don't need affordable health care. We need free, government-sponsored health care. And these kinds of conflicts are going to dog the Biden administration from the very onset. And so I think that activists have to sort of, in the US, there's this thing now that, what's your plan to vote, which in and of itself is an indictment of American democracy. In the US, you can't just go out and vote. You have to have a plan to vote because the Republicans want to steal your vote and suppress your right and access to vote. So the rejoinder has been, what is your plan to vote? I think we also have to say, what is your plan on November 4th? No matter who wins. I expect it'll be Biden. It could be Trump, but no matter who wins, what is the plan the day after the election to begin to apply the political pressure necessary to force this state to produce? And we've seen in April, the American government pull $3.5 trillion out of thin air. And so this constant, response that we don't have the money and we can't do this, that has been shattered. And so for the Biden administration, there will be a tremendous amount of need and a tremendous amount of pressure from day one.
Keeanga Taylor, thank you so much for giving us and discussing these issues. It's been extremely illuminating and powerful. Thank you very much. But we need to come to an end now. Thank you.
All right, take care.